The ferry's engine growled as it approached the island, breaking the serene silence of the early morning. The Jenkins family, Michael, Sarah, and their 2 children, Ben and Lily, stood on the deck, eyes wide with anticipation and a hint of trepidation. The island loomed ahead, shrouded in a thin veil of mist that seemed reluctant to lift. The mansion, their new home, emerged from the fog as the ferry drew closer. It was a grand Gothic structure with tall spires and ivy-clad walls. Its windows, dark and uninviting, stared back at them like empty eyes. Sarah shivered involuntarily, pulling her coat tighter around her. "It's bigger than I imagined," Ben muttered, his voice a mix of awe and anxiety. "Yeah," Michael replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Think of the space we'll have. You'll each get your own room. It's going to be a great adventure." Lily, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, glanced up at her mother. "Mommy, do you think there are ghosts?" Sarah forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Of course not, sweetheart. It's just an old house. Old houses have stories, that's all." As the ferry docked, the family disembarked, their footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. A local man, introduced as Mr. Thompson, greeted them with a nod. His weathered face and somber eyes gave away years of life on the island. "Welcome to Blackwood Island," he said, his voice gravelly. "The mansion is just up the hill. I've taken the liberty of having some supplies delivered. If you need anything, my house is just down the road." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Michael said, shaking his hand. "We appreciate your help." Mr. Thompson's gaze lingered on the mansion, a shadow crossing his face. "Be careful up there. The place has a history. If you hear anything strange, it's probably just the wind. This island can play tricks on you." With that ominous warning, the Jenkins family began their ascent to the mansion. The path was overgrown, flanked by ancient trees that seemed to whisper among themselves. As they reached the crest of the hill, the full grandeur of the mansion came into view. Michael unlocked the front door and it creaked open, revealing a vast foyer. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the high windows, casting an ethereal glow. A grand staircase spiraled up to the second floor, and elaborate chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dulled by years of neglect. "This place is incredible," Michael said, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Just think of the potential." Sarah nodded, though her eyes darted around nervously. "Let's get unpacked and settled in. We have a lot of work ahead of us." As the family explored their new home, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the far corner of the foyer, an antique mirror reflected their movements. Lily paused in front of it, tilting her head as if listening. "Emily says welcome," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's Emily, honey?" Sarah asked, her heart skipping a beat. Lily turned to her mother, her eyes wide and innocent. "My new friend. She lives here too." Sarah's smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself. "That's nice, dear. Now let's get your room set up." As the day wore on, the family busied themselves with unpacking. But as night fell, the mansion seemed to come alive with a life of its own. The walls groaned, and the wind howled through the cracks. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. In the middle of the night, Sarah woke to a soft, rhythmic tapping. She sat up in bed, straining to identify the source. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. She nudged Michael awake. "Do you hear that?" Michael groaned, half asleep. "It's just the house settling, Sarah. Go back to sleep." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. The tapping grew louder, leading her to the door of a room they hadn't explored yet. Taking a deep breath, She pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair that creaked back and forth as if moved by an unseen hand. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Sarah backed away slowly, closing the door. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure at the end of the hall, just for a moment. Her heart pounded in her chest, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She hurried back to bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. The mansion's secrets were starting to reveal themselves, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. In the quiet darkness, a soft whisper echoed through the halls, barely audible. "Welcome home." The morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Despite the previous night's unsettling events, the Jenkins family attempted to resume a semblance of normalcy. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with the children chatting quietly while Michael and Sarah exchanged concerned glances. Lily was the first to break the uneasy silence. "Emily says we should explore the garden today." Michael looked up from his coffee, frowning. "Who's Emily, Lily?" "My new friend," Lily replied matter-of-factly, spreading jam on her toast. "She says there's a secret place in the garden." Sarah and Michael shared a worried look. "Maybe it's best if we stick together today," Sarah suggested. "We can all explore the garden after breakfast." The garden was overgrown, wild with tangled vines and untamed bushes. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As the family wandered through the neglected paths, they discovered hidden corners and long-forgotten statues, their features eroded by time. Lily skipped ahead, leading them to a secluded area at the back of the garden. There, concealed beneath a canopy of ivy, was an old stone bench. It faced a small, murky pond, its surface covered in a layer of green algae. "Emily says this is where she used to play," Lily announced, sitting on the bench and patting the spot next to her. Sarah sat beside her daughter, a shiver running down her spine. "Lily, honey, what else does Emily tell you?" Lily swung her legs, her eyes fixed on the pond. "She says she's sad because her family went away and never came back. She's been waiting for them." Before Sarah could ask more, Ben called out from nearby. "Hey, I found something." They joined Ben, who was crouched beside a half-buried stone. He brushed away the dirt to reveal a weather-worn plaque. The inscription was barely legible, but with some effort, they deciphered the names. The Blackwood family. Edmund, Clara, and Emily. Sarah's heart sank. "Emily Blackwood," she murmured. "That's who Lily's been talking to." Michael, trying to maintain a brave front, suggested they head back to the house. "It's just a coincidence. Let's not scare ourselves over nothing." As they returned to the mansion, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the house itself was aware of their discovery. The day passed uneventfully, but as night fell, the familiar sense of unease returned. After putting the children to bed, Sarah found herself drawn to the attic. The narrow staircase creaked under her weight, and she felt a chill in the air as she reached the top. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and dusty sheets. In the far corner, a large ornate mirror caught her eye. Its surface was cloudy, but as Sarah approached, she saw her reflection and something else. A shadowy figure standing just behind her. She spun around, but the attic was empty. Heart pounding, she opened a nearby trunk, hoping to find something that could explain the strange occurrences. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a leather-bound diary. The diary belonged to Clara Blackwood, and the entries were filled with tales of joy, sorrow, and eventually, terror. One entry stood out. December 5th, 1893. The whispers have started again. Edmund says it's just the wind, but I know better. Emily sees them too, the shadowy figures at the edge of her vision. They grow bolder each night. I fear for our safety. Sarah clutched the diary to her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She needed to show this to Michael. As she turned to leave, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and a cold breeze swept through, rustling the pages of the diary. A whisper, barely audible, echoed in the darkness. "Help us." Panicked, Sarah yanked the door open and fled down the stairs, the diary clutched tightly in her hands. She found Michael in the study, his face pale as he looked up from the letter he was reading. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, his voice trembling. He handed her the letter, dated the same day as the diary entry. It was from Edmund Blackwood, addressed to a friend, pleading for help. He described the same whispers, the same shadowy figures, and a growing fear that something terrible was about to happen. They stared at each other, the weight of the mansion's dark history pressing down on them. The echoes of the past were growing louder, and it was becoming clear that the spirits of the Blackwood family were not at rest. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The atmosphere inside the mansion mirrored the weather outside, tense and foreboding. Michael and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the diary and letter spread out before them. "We need to understand what happened here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be a reason why the Blackwoods are still here, why they can't move on." Michael nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll start by searching the library. Maybe there are records or documents that can shed some light on this." The mansion's library was a vast, dusty room filled with towering bookshelves that seemed to reach the ceiling. Michael spent hours sifting through old books, ledgers, and newspapers, uncovering snippets of the island's history. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to read Clara Blackwood's diary, hoping to piece together the events that led to their tragic fate. She was drawn deeper into Clara's world, feeling her growing dread and desperation. One particular entry caught her attention. January 3rd, 1894. Edmund has found an old tome in the library, filled with strange symbols and incantations. He believes it may hold the key to our salvation, but I am not so sure. The shadows are growing bolder, and Emily's nightmares are becoming more frequent. I fear we are meddling with forces beyond our understanding. Sarah's heart pounded as she read the entry. What had Edmund discovered? Could it be the cause of the haunting? She shared her findings with Michael, who had just emerged from the library looking grim. "I found something too," Michael said, holding up an ancient leather-bound book. "This is the tome Edmund mentioned. It's filled with occult rituals and spells. He must have been desperate to protect his family." They pored over the tome together, trying to decipher its archaic language and cryptic illustrations. The book was filled with dark rites and forbidden knowledge, warning of dire consequences for those who dared to use its power. As they delved deeper, a chill seemed to settle over the room, and the shadows lengthened, creeping toward them as if drawn by the dark energy of the book. Sarah shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "We need to be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't know what we're dealing with." That night, the mansion felt more oppressive than ever. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. The family gathered in the living room, trying to take their minds off the eerie occurrences by playing a board game. But their laughter was forced, and their eyes kept darting toward the dark corners of the room, Just as they were starting to relax, a loud crash echoed through the house. They jumped up, hearts racing. The sound had come from the basement. Michael grabbed a flashlight, and Sarah followed, leaving Ben and Lily in the living room with strict instructions not to move. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. The flashlight beam flickered as they descended the creaking wooden stairs. At the bottom, they found an old cabinet toppled over, its contents spilled across the floor. Among the debris was a weathered journal, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling. The journal belonged to Emily Blackwood. As she flipped through the pages, a story of innocence lost and growing terror unfolded. Emily described seeing shadowy figures, hearing whispers in the night, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. February 10th, 1894. Father says the rituals will protect us, but I am scared. The shadows are everywhere, and I can hear them calling my name. Mother cries at night, and I don't know what to do. I want to leave this place, but we are trapped. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she read the entries. Emily's fear and confusion were palpable, echoing the terror they were experiencing now. Michael put a comforting arm around her, his expression grim. "We need to find a way to end this," he said softly. "We can't let the same fate befall our family." Back upstairs, they shared their discoveries with Ben and Lily. Though frightened, the children were brave, determined to help in any way they could. "We have to figure out what went wrong with the rituals," Michael said, pacing the room. "Maybe if we understand that, we can find a way to put the spirits to rest." As night fell, the mansion seemed to close in around them, the air heavy with anticipation. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the halls, and the shadows moved with a will of their own. It was clear that the spirits were growing restless, their anger and sorrow reaching a boiling point. Sarah sat by the fireplace, flipping through Emily's journal once more, looking for any clues they might have missed. Her heart ached for the little girl, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and the room was plunged into darkness as the fire flickered out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows coalesced into a dark, menacing figure at the edge of the room. "Help us," the figure intoned, its voice a chorus of despair. "Free us from this torment." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to speak. "How? How can we help you?" The figure moved closer, its form shifting and writhing. "The book, the rituals, they must be completed. Only then will we find peace." The figure dissipated into the shadows, leaving the room deathly silent. Sarah and Michael exchanged a determined look. They knew what they had to do, but the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. The spirits of the Blackwood family were counting on them, and they couldn't afford to fail. The next day, the family awoke with a renewed sense of purpose, though a palpable fear still hung in the air. The haunting presence of the Blackwood spirits demanded attention, and they knew they couldn't ignore the mansion's dark secrets any longer. Michael decided to explore the basement once more, specifically the locked room he had discovered earlier. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, he made his way down the creaking stairs, Sarah close behind him. The door was old and weathered, its surface marred with deep scratches as if something had tried to claw its way out. Michael hesitated for a moment before prying it open. The wood splintered under the pressure, and the door swung open with a groan, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. Sarah shined the flashlight into the room, and they stepped inside, the air growing colder with each passing moment. The room was sparse, containing only a few pieces of broken furniture and a large, dusty chest in the center. Symbols and runes were etched into the walls, their meaning ominous and obscure. Michael approached the chest, his hands trembling slightly. He lifted the heavy lid, and a cloud of dust billowed out. Inside were remnants of occult practices, candles, strange artifacts, and an ancient book bound in cracked leather. The air grew thicker, and the sense of foreboding intensified. Sarah picked up the book and carefully opened it. The pages were filled with more of the strange symbols and incantations, similar to those they had seen in Edmund Blackwood's tome. One page in particular stood out. It described a ritual meant to banish malevolent spirits and bring peace to the restless dead. "This must be it," Sarah whispered. "The ritual they tried to perform, but something must have gone wrong." Michael nodded, his expression grim. "We need to understand exactly what happened. There has to be something we're missing." As they pored over the book, a chill swept through the room, and they heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the hall above. The house seemed to be alive with whispers, the walls vibrating with unseen energy. "We should go back upstairs," Michael said, his voice tense. "We need to stay together." They returned to the main floor, the sense of dread following them like a shadow. The children were in the living room, their faces pale but determined. Lily clutched her teddy bear tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "Emily's scared," she said softly. "She says they're getting angrier." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, her heart aching. "We're going to help them, Lily. We're going to make this right." That evening, as the sun set and the shadows deepened, the family gathered in the living room to discuss their next steps. The book from the basement lay open on the coffee table, its pages filled with dark, twisted knowledge. "We have to perform the ritual," Michael said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "But we need to be sure we're doing it correctly. If we make a mistake..." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. "We need more information. There has to be something else in this house that can help us." As they discussed their plan, a loud crash echoed from the basement, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, more insistent and angry than before. "We're running out of time," Michael said, his voice urgent. "We need to find out what happened to the Blackwoods and why the ritual failed." The family split up to search the house for more clues. Michael and Ben headed to the attic, while Sarah and Lily explored the old servants' quarters. Each step they took seemed to echo with the voices of the past, the mansion's dark history pressing down on them. In the attic, Michael and Ben uncovered more journals and letters, each one adding a piece to the puzzle. They read about the growing desperation of the Blackwood family, their increasing fear and paranoia as the hauntings intensified. Meanwhile, Sarah and Lily found a hidden compartment in one of the old wardrobes. Inside was a bundle of letters addressed to Clara Blackwood from a local priest. The letters spoke of dark forces and the dangers of meddling with the occult. The last letter was a desperate plea for Clara to leave the mansion before it was too late. With their findings in hand, the family regrouped in the living room. As they shared what they had discovered, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The Blackwoods were desperate to protect themselves, Sarah said, holding up the priest's letters. But they didn't fully understand the forces they were dealing with. The ritual they performed was supposed to banish the spirits, but instead, it trapped them here. "We have to complete the ritual correctly," Michael added, pointing to the ancient book. "We have to finish what they started and free the Blackwood spirits." As the clock struck midnight, the house seemed to hold its breath. The family stood together, determined to face the darkness and end the curse that had plagued the mansion for over a century. They knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but they were ready to confront the malevolent forces and put the spirits to rest once and for all. The clock's chime echoed through the mansion, marking midnight and heralding the start of a night none of them would ever forget. The Jenkins family stood in the foyer, the ancient book of rituals open on a small table before them. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if aware of their intentions. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "Let's begin," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. They gathered in a circle, holding hands. The book's pages rustled in an unseen breeze, and the candles flickered ominously. Michael began to recite the incantation, his voice echoing off the walls. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, crawling across the floor like living things. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a shrill scream pierced the silence. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The children huddled closer to their parents, their faces pale with fear. A ghostly figure materialized in the center of the room. It was a woman, her face twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and dark. Her long, tattered dress billowed around her as she floated above the floor. "Help us," she moaned, her voice a haunting wail. "Free us from this torment." Sarah's grip tightened on Lily's hand. "We're trying to help," she said, her voice shaking. "Tell us what went wrong. How can we free you?" The spirit's eyes locked onto Sarah's, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull the light from the room. "The ritual must be completed," she whispered. "But beware, the darkness will not let us go easily." As she spoke, the room grew darker still, and more figures began to appear, shadowy shapes that writhed and twisted in the gloom. The air was filled with a cacophony of whispers, each voice a desperate plea for release. Michael continued the incantation, his voice growing stronger as he chanted the ancient words. The figures grew more distinct, their faces contorted in agony. They reached out with ghostly hands, their touch icy cold. One of the spirits lunged at Ben, its fingers grazing his arm. He cried out in pain, clutching at the spot where the spirit had touched him. Sarah pulled him close, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to finish this," Michael shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of the restless spirits. He raised the book high, chanting the final lines of the ritual. The room erupted in a blinding light, and the spirits screamed, their voices merging into a single, agonized wail. The air crackled with energy, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The light intensified, filling every corner of the room. The spirits writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into the brightness. For a moment, it seemed as if the very fabric of the house would tear apart. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The room was plunged into silence and darkness. The oppressive weight that had filled the air was gone, and the mansion felt eerily still. Sarah looked around, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Did it work?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A soft, ghostly light flickered at the edge of her vision. She turned to see the woman's spirit, her face now serene and peaceful. "Thank you," she said, her voice a gentle sigh. "We are free." With that, the spirit faded, leaving behind only a faint, lingering sense of peace. The shadows retreated, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The family stood in stunned silence, their hearts pounding. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but the memory of that night would haunt them forever. As they turned to leave the room, a final whisper echoed through the air, a reminder of the mansion's dark past. "Beware the darkness. It may return." The family knew they had won only a temporary reprieve. The island and its haunted mansion held many more secrets, and the darkness was never truly vanquished. But for now, they had bought themselves some time and freed the spirits of the Blackwood family from their torment. They climbed the stairs to their bedrooms, exhausted but hopeful. The night had been long and terrifying, but they had faced it together. And together, they would uncover the remaining secrets of the mansion and ensure that the darkness would never again claim another victim. Despite their brief victory, the mansion's oppressive atmosphere only seemed to deepen in the following days. The whispering shadows, though no longer as frequent, still lurked in the corners of their vision, and the temperature remained unnaturally cold. Sarah woke in the middle of the night, her heart racing, her mind filled with vivid nightmares of shadowy figures and whispering voices. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to shake the lingering dread. As she stared into the mirror, she saw a flicker of movement behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The reflection in the mirror, however, showed something different. A figure standing just behind her, its face obscured by shadows. She blinked, and it was gone. Sarah's nerves were frayed, and the constant tension was taking its toll. She found herself snapping at the children over minor things, and Michael was growing increasingly distant, consumed by his own fears and the pressure to protect his family. Lily's behavior became more erratic. She frequently spoke to Emily, her imaginary friend, and often seemed to be in a trance, her eyes glazed and unfocused. One afternoon, Sarah found Lily sitting in the garden, staring blankly at the murky pond. "Lily, what are you doing out here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with worry. "Emily says they're coming," Lily replied, her voice eerily calm. "They're not happy that we tried to send them away." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who's coming, sweetheart?" Lily turned to her mother, her eyes wide and unblinking. "The angry ones. They don't want to go." That night, the hauntings escalated. The walls shook, and a cacophony of voices filled the air, shouting, crying, and whispering all at once. The children screamed in terror, huddling together in their parents' room. Michael grabbed the ancient book, desperately searching for something they might have missed. "We need to finish the ritual," Michael insisted, his voice barely audible over the din. "There has to be a way to complete it properly." Sarah, fighting back tears, nodded. "But how? We did everything the book said." As the night wore on, the spirits grew more aggressive. Objects flew across the room, and a shadowy figure appeared at the foot of their bed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Michael held the book up like a shield, chanting the incantation over and over, but the figure only laughed, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through the room. "Your efforts are in vain," it hissed. "We are bound to this place, and so are you." The figure lunged at them, its icy hands reaching out. Michael stumbled backward, dropping the book. Sarah grabbed the children and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. They fled to the basement, seeking refuge in the locked room. As they huddled together, the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around them. The shadows twisted and writhed, and the air grew so cold their breath turned to mist. Sarah clutched Lily tightly, whispering soothing words, though her own fear was overwhelming. Michael, shaking with terror and determination, picked up the fallen book and resumed the ritual. His voice grew louder, more insistent, as he called upon whatever forces he could to banish the spirits once and for all. The shadows recoiled, but the figure at the foot of the bed remained, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. It lunged again, and Michael screamed in pain as it seized his arm. The air filled with the scent of burning flesh, and the book slipped from his grasp. Desperation overtook Sarah. She snatched the book from the floor, her hands trembling as she read the incantation aloud. The shadows shrieked in anger, and the figure released Michael, its form flickering and weakening. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the spirits screamed in unison, their voices merging into a single agonized wail. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into the brightness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished, leaving the room in darkness. The oppressive weight lifted, and the mansion fell silent. The shadows were gone, and the air was still. Michael collapsed to the floor, clutching his burned arm. Sarah rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. The children clung to her, their eyes wide with fear. "Did it work?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her heart still racing. "I think so. I think we finally did it." But as they helped Michael to his feet and made their way back upstairs, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. In the quiet darkness, a soft whisper echoed through the halls. "We are not gone. We will never be gone." The family knew their ordeal was far from over. The mansion's secrets were still buried deep, and the spirit's anger had not been fully quenched. The descent into madness had only just begun, and they would need all their strength and courage to face the darkness that still lurked within the mansion's walls. The following morning, a heavy silence hung over the mansion. The events of the previous night had left the Jenkins family shaken and exhausted. Michael's arm was bandaged, but the pain and fear lingered. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Over breakfast, Sarah suggested they reach out to the local historian Mr. Thompson had mentioned when they first arrived. If anyone knew the true history of the mansion and the island, it would be him. Michael agreed, and they decided to pay him a visit that afternoon. The historian, Dr. Alan Whitaker, lived in a modest cottage at the edge of the island. He was an elderly man with a kind face, but his eyes held a depth of knowledge and a hint of sadness. He welcomed them in and listened intently as they recounted their experiences. "I had hoped this place had finally found peace," Dr. Whitaker said, shaking his head. "The Blackwood Mansion has always been shrouded in darkness. The islanders speak of it in hushed tones, afraid to stir the spirits that linger there." "Why are the spirits so restless?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to the Blackwoods?" Dr. Whitaker sighed and leaned back in his chair. The Blackwood family was indeed plagued by misfortune. Edmund Blackwood dabbled in the occult, hoping to protect his family from the spirits he believed were haunting them. But his attempts only made things worse. He pulled an old leather-bound journal from a shelf and handed it to Michael. This belonged to Edmund. It details his descent into madness and the rituals he performed. But there's more to the story. Something darker. Something he didn't fully understand. Michael flipped through the journal, his eyes widening as he read. The entries were filled with increasingly desperate attempts to banish the spirits, culminating in a final catastrophic ritual that sealed their fate. "There's a mention of a dark entity," Michael said, looking up. Edmund believed it was the source of the hauntings, a malevolent force that fed on fear and suffering. Dr. Whitaker nodded. "Yes, the islanders call it the Dark One. It's an ancient spirit, older than the mansion itself. It thrives on the energy of the tormented souls trapped there." "Is there a way to banish it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is a ritual," Dr. Whitaker said slowly, "but it's dangerous. It requires a powerful medium and an unbreakable will. The Dark One will do everything in its power to stop you." Michael and Sarah exchanged a determined look. "We have to try," Michael said. We can't live like this, and we can't let the spirits suffer any longer." Dr. Whitaker nodded, his expression grave. "Very well, I'll help you. But you must understand the risks. The Dark One is cunning and powerful. It will exploit your deepest fears and weaknesses." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Dr. Whitaker provided them with the necessary materials and instructed them on the steps of the ritual. As night fell, the air grew heavy with anticipation and dread. Back at the mansion, the family gathered in the foyer, their hearts pounding. Dr. Whitaker stood at the center, his presence a steadying force. He began the ritual, chanting in a language that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the house. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The ground shook, and a dark, swirling vortex appeared in the center of the room. The Dark One's presence was palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them. "Hold the circle," Dr. Whitaker shouted over the roar of the vortex. "Do not break the chant, no matter what happens." The family joined hands, their voices trembling but steady as they repeated the incantation. The shadows twisted and writhed, and the Dark One's voice echoed through the room, a chorus of hatred and malice. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed. "I have fed on the fear of this place for centuries. You are nothing to me." The vortex grew larger, and the spirits of the Blackwood family appeared, their faces contorted in pain. They reached out, their eyes pleading for release. "Focus," Dr. Whitaker commanded. "We're almost there." The room shook violently, and the temperature plummeted. The Dark One's form began to emerge from the vortex, a towering figure of darkness, its eyes burning with malevolent fire. Sarah felt her resolve waver, her deepest fears surfacing in her mind. The Dark One's voice filled her head, whispering of failure and despair, but she looked at her family, at Michael's determined face and her children's frightened but brave expressions, and she found the strength to continue. With a final defiant chant, the circle of light around them intensified, and the Dark One shrieked in fury. The vortex collapsed in on itself, and the room was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, the mansion was eerily silent. The oppressive weight had lifted, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. The spirits of the Blackwood family stood before them, their faces serene. "Thank you," Clara's spirit whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "We are free." With that, the spirits dissolved into the light, leaving the room empty and peaceful. The family collapsed in exhaustion, the ordeal finally over. Dr. Whitaker smiled, though his eyes were sad. "You've done it. The Dark One is banished, and the spirits are at rest." The family hugged each other tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but they knew the island's history would always be a part of them. As they left the mansion, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the island in a warm golden light. The haunted mansion stood silent, its dark past finally laid to rest. The Jenkins family could now look forward to a future free of fear, but the memory of their ordeal would forever be etched in their hearts. Days passed and a tentative calm settled over the mansion. The Jenkins family began to hope that their ordeal was finally over. However, the peace was short-lived. The whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and a sense of dread permeated the air once more. Michael and Sarah knew that they hadn't completely vanquished the darkness. The presence of the Dark One lingered, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They had to confront it one last time and ensure it was banished for good. The family gathered in the living room, determination etched on their faces. "We need to finish this," Michael said, his voice firm. "We can't keep living in fear." Dr. Whitaker, who had stayed to help, nodded in agreement. "The Dark One is weakened but not defeated. It's desperate and will try anything to regain its power." Sarah looked at her children, her heart aching with fear for them. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said, squeezing Michael's hand. "We have to protect our family." Dr. Whitaker began to prepare for the final ritual, gathering the necessary materials and drawing intricate symbols on the floor. The air grew thick with tension as the family stood in a circle, ready to face the darkness once more. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped, and the mansion seemed to hold its breath. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the halls like a chorus of despair. The ground trembled, and the shadows writhed with malevolent energy. "Stay focused, Doctor," Whitaker instructed, his voice calm but urgent. "Do not break the circle, no matter what happens." Michael and Sarah exchanged a determined glance, their grip on each other's hands tightening. Ben and Lily stood between them, their faces pale but resolute. They began to chant, their voices blending with Dr. Whitaker's as they called upon ancient forces to banish the Dark One. The air crackled with energy, and a dark vortex formed in the center of the room. The Dark One's presence was palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them. The shadows twisted and coalesced into a towering figure, its eyes burning with rage. "You cannot defeat me," the Dark One hissed, its voice a venomous snarl. "I will consume your fear and make it my own." The room shook violently, and the candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The family continued to chant, their voices rising in defiance. The Dark One lunged at them, its form shifting and writhing as it tried to break the circle. A piercing scream filled the air as the Dark One's icy hand reached for Lily. Sarah pulled her daughter close, her heart pounding with terror. "Stay strong," she shouted. "We're almost there." Dr. Whitaker's voice grew louder, his words a powerful incantation that reverberated through the room. The symbols on the floor glowed with an intense light, and the Dark One recoiled, its form flickering and weakening. "We can do this," Michael said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to." The family's voices merged into a single, unwavering chant, their resolve unbreakable. The light around them intensified, pushing back the darkness. The Dark One shrieked in fury, its form disintegrating in the blinding radiance. With a final, desperate roar, the Dark One was consumed by the light. The vortex collapsed in on itself, and the mansion was plunged into silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air felt lighter, filled with a sense of peace and relief. The family collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. Dr. Whitaker smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "You've done it," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "The Dark One is gone, and the spirits are free." The Jenkins family hugged each other tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, their bond stronger than ever. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the mansion stood silent and peaceful. The whispers were gone, and the shadows no longer held their malevolent presence. The island's dark history had been laid to rest, and the Jenkins family could finally look forward to a future free of fear. But as they stood together, watching the sunrise, they knew that the memory of their ordeal would forever be etched in their hearts. The mansion had tested them in ways they never could have imagined, but it had also brought them closer together. And in the quiet moments of the early morning, they felt a sense of gratitude for the strength they had found in each other, knowing that no darkness could ever break their family's bond. The dawn brought a newfound sense of peace to the Jenkins family. The oppressive atmosphere of the mansion had lifted, and the whispers had finally ceased. Yet, the memory of their ordeal lingered like a shadow over their hearts. They knew they couldn't stay on Blackwood Island any longer. Michael and Sarah made the decision to leave the mansion behind and start anew on the mainland. The children, though still shaken, were relieved. They packed their belongings, their movements brisk and determined. The house, once filled with malevolent whispers and dark shadows, now stood silent and empty, a shell of its former self. As they boarded the ferry, Mr. Thompson stood at the dock, his expression a mix of relief and sadness. "You did it," he said, shaking Michael's hand. "You freed this island from its curse." Michael nodded, his eyes weary but hopeful. "It wasn't easy, but we couldn't have done it without Dr. Whitaker." Mr. Thompson's gaze shifted to the distant mansion. "It's been a long time coming. The Blackwood family can finally rest in peace." The ferry pulled away from the dock, and the island slowly receded into the distance. The mansion, once a looming symbol of darkness and despair, now seemed almost peaceful, bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. As the mainland came into view, the family felt a sense of relief wash over them. The weight of the mansion's dark history had been lifted from their shoulders, and they were ready to start a new chapter of their lives. They found a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the haunting memories of Blackwood Island. The first few weeks were filled with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The children often woke in the middle of the night, crying out from nightmares of shadowy figures and whispering voices. Sarah and Michael did their best to comfort them, knowing that it would take time for the wounds to heal. They kept a close eye on Lily, who had been the most affected by the spirits. Gradually, her imaginary friend Emily faded from her conversations, replaced by the innocent chatter of a child rediscovering joy. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Sarah noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air felt lighter, and the house seemed to exude a warmth that had been absent since their time on the island. "We've come a long way," Michael said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We've faced the darkness and come out stronger." Sarah smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "We have, and will continue to heal, together." The children nodded, their faces brightening with hope. The mansion and its horrors were behind them, but the experience had forged an unbreakable bond between them. Months passed, and the family slowly rebuilt their lives. The nightmares grew less frequent, and the shadows that had once haunted their every step faded into distant memories. They found solace in their new home, surrounded by the love and support of their neighbors. One sunny afternoon, a letter arrived from Dr. Whitaker. He had continued his research into the history of Blackwood Island and had uncovered more details about the Dark One. His letter was filled with gratitude for their bravery and a reminder that they had helped to break a cycle of suffering that had lasted for generations. Sarah read the letter aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. "We did something important," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "We made a difference." Michael nodded, wrapping his arm around her. "We did. And we'll keep moving forward. Together." The family stood on the porch, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood that had become their sanctuary. The sun set on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over their new home. They knew that the darkness of Blackwood Island was behind them, but the strength and resilience they had found in each other would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. In the quiet moments of the evening, as they settled into the comfort of their new life, the Jenkins family felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious, their bond unbroken and their spirits unbowed. And as the stars twinkled above, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, stronger and more united than ever before. The haunted mansion on the island was now a distant memory, a testament to their courage and resilience. The Jenkins family had escaped the darkness and found the light, and in that light, they discovered the true meaning of home.